He is 16 years old. And his body is already eating itself alive. Not slowly. Not mercifully. Every morning he wakes up and something else is gone, sensation in his fingers, feeling in his hands, the ability to grip a sword, the ability to feel his own face. His own flesh turning against him, nerve by nerve. And yet, 10 years from now, the most powerful conqueror in the world will stand at this boy's grave. In silence. Unwilling to touch it. How a dying child earned that silence, that is the story I'm going to tell you today. Before the battle, we need to talk about the years before it. Because what Baldwin did on that battlefield didn't begin at Montgisard. It began years earlier, in the quiet, brutal process of learning to exist inside a body that was slowly dying. He was 9 years old when his tutor noticed it. The boy was playing with friends. They were digging their fingernails into his arms, and he wasn't reacting. No pain. No flinch. His tutor, William of Tyre, watched in horror as he realized the child couldn't feel his own skin. The diagnosis was leprosy. In the medieval world, leprosy was a living death sentence. It meant exile. It meant your possessions were divided among your heirs while you still breathed. You watched your own body decay in isolation while society treated you as already dead. But Baldwin was the heir to the kingdom of Jerusalem. There was no one else. By 13, he was king. By 15, the numbness was spreading. His hands were betraying him. His squires modified his equipment, reins looped around his arms instead of held in his fist, a saddle built for stability rather than control. His men stayed close, ready to guide his horse if he lost it. And his sword. Before battle, his squires tied it directly to his gauntlet. Because if it slipped, he'd never feel it leave his hand. That's not courage. That's refusal. The refusal to let a dying body decide what a living mind could or could not do. And it would define every decision he made from that day forward. By 1177, Saladin had spent years doing what no ruler in the region had done before him. He unified the fractured Muslim world into a single coherent force. Egypt. Syria. Mesopotamia. Rival emirs who had spent generations fighting each other were now marching under the same banner, bound together through diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the occasional siege when persuasion ran out. Saladin was a man who waited until the mathematics were so far in his favor that the outcome stopped being a question. And at that time, they were. The Crusader military had been pulled north, drawn into a Byzantine alliance that promised much and delivered nothing. What remained defending Jerusalem was a fraction of its usual strength. Saladin's intelligence confirmed it. The timing was right, the road was open, and the kingdom that had resisted him for years was, for the first time, genuinely exposed. He mobilized his men and marched with over 20,000 army. They marched into Crusader territory in November of 1177. And wasn't expecting a fight, that was the point. Saladin's scouts had confirmed the road south was open. His force spread across miles at campaign pace, baggage trains, supply columns, cavalry moving without the discipline of an army expecting contact. Before Baldwin rode out to meet them, Odo of St. Ammon brought forward the true cross. The relic traveled under the protection of the Bishop of Bethlehem, who carried it into the field. To the knights assembling around it, it was the literal presence of God moving with them into the desert. Men who believe that stop calculating whether they'll survive. Baldwin moved with a force of roughly 500 knights and several thousand infantry towards Saladin's unprepared column. He caught them near Montgisard on the 25th of November, the force unformed, the vanguard too far ahead to recall, the rear still moving. The Crusaders hit them before that changed. Heavy cavalry driving into columns with no time to receive the charge. The front didn't break, it collapsed inward, rear units pushing forward into chaos they couldn't yet see. Saladin's Mamluks threw themselves into the crush not to hold the line but to buy their master enough time to escape. Then a freezing downpour turned the ground to mud. Retreat routes became impassable. As the Ayyubid forces struggled to escape, local Bedouins, sensing the shift in power, hunt the retreating soldiers. Crusader accounts claimed 9 in 10 of the invading force were lost. Even discounting for exaggeration. Saladin fled on a swift racing camel, abandoning his baggage train, his treasure, and his army. He returned to Cairo and realized he could not simply rush in to take Jerusalem. Montgisard pushed him to adopt a more methodical, patient strategy of attrition, burning crops, destroying supplies, and conducting raids to weaken the Crusader state's economy. The victory at Montgisard had bought years. But years have a cost. And Baldwin's body was paying it faster than anyone else. By late 1183, at the age of 22, Baldwin IV was severely debilitated. He was often blind. He had lost the use of his limbs. He could no longer ride, no longer even sit upright without help. He had to be carried on a litter. That same year, Saladin came for Kerak. Kerak was a fortress carved into a Jordanian ridgeline, one of the most formidable castles in the entire kingdom. And inside its walls, a wedding was taking place. The bride was Baldwin's own stepsister, Isabella. The defenders were desperately holding on, while the wedding guests watched from the walls as Muslim siege engines pounded the stone. Lady Stephanie, the groom's mother, sent food out to Saladin from the wedding feast. And Saladin, in return, asked her which tower the newlyweds were staying in. He reportedly ordered his engineers not to hit it. Despite being barely able to move, Baldwin ordered his entire army to march towards Kerak. He had himself strapped onto a stretcher and placed at the head of the column. Now Saladin had every advantage. Numbers. Momentum. The element of surprise. But the moment his scouts reported that King of Jerusalem himself was coming to relieve the siege, he did something unexpected. He dismantled his siege engines, packed up, and retreated to Damascus. Baldwin IV died in March 1185. He was 24. His successor was his nephew, Baldwin V. Just 9 years old. The old king had crowned the boy co-ruler 2 years earlier, knowing his own body was failing and that a child king was the kingdom's best hope for a stable transition. He had also assembled a carefully balanced regency council, binding his most powerful barons by oath to protect the boy's rule until he came of age. Baldwin V lasted barely a year. He died in the summer of 1186. His body was carried through the streets of Jerusalem in a funeral procession while the factions his uncle had held together began tearing each other apart. Guy de Lusignan was not supposed to be king. Baldwin IV had spent his final years actively trying to keep him away from the throne. Guy had arrived from France only a few years earlier, a nobleman of unremarkable pedigree with one thing going for him: he married Baldwin's sister, Sibylla. Baldwin saw exactly what kind of king Guy would make, which is why he personally crowned his nephew Baldwin V himself, racing against his own decay to lock Guy out of the succession. But when the king died and the child king followed him within a year, all those safeguards collapsed. Sibylla was the legitimate heir. In 1186, she was crowned queen. And in front of the assembled nobility, she took the crown and placed it on her husband's head herself, and Guy de Lusignan became king. Beside him stood Reynald of Chatillon, a veteran lord who had spent 16 years in a Muslim prison and emerged with nothing resembling restraint. Reynald had been raiding Muslim caravans and breaking truces for years. Baldwin IV had barely managed to control him. Guy didn't even try. They lasted 24 months. The spark came in early 1187. Reynald attacked a massive Muslim caravan traveling between Cairo and Damascus. It was a direct violation of the truce with Saladin. When Saladin demanded restitution and punishment, Guy ordered Reynald to comply. Reynald refused. Saladin had his pretext for war. In July, Saladin struck. His army crossed the Jordan and laid siege to Tiberias, deliberately capturing the town but leaving the citadel holding out. Inside that citadel was the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, the one baron who had consistently advised restraint. Guy summoned his war council. The army was gathered at Sepphoris, a well-watered position surrounded by springs. Raymond of Tripoli himself stood before the king and argued against marching. But Reynald of Chatillon and the military orders called Raymond a coward and a traitor. They whispered to Guy that if he sat here while a Christian city burned and a noblewoman was captured, he would be seen as weak. He would be no king at all. Guy wrestled with the decision through the night. In the morning, he gave the order to march straight into a waterless desert, in the height of summer heat. Saladin's scouts spotted them immediately. By midday, the Muslim army had cut off every approach to water. Saladin surrounded them, harassed their columns with archers, denied them any relief for an entire day and night as they struggled forward. By the time the army reached the Horns of Hattin, it wasn't an army anymore. It was a column of exhausted, dehydrated men collapsing under their own armor. Contemporary chroniclers described knights dying on their knees in the dirt, begging for water that would never come. Men drank their own blood. Their own urine. It didn't matter. Thirst killed them before swords ever did. When the fighting ended, the military capacity of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was wiped out in a single afternoon. The true cross, the most sacred relic in the kingdom, carried into every battle for generations, was captured by Saladin's forces and never seen again. The defeat was so catastrophic that resistance simply collapsed. One by one, the cities and castles of the kingdom threw open their gates: Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Bethlehem, each falling not with a siege, but with a knock. By September, only Jerusalem remained. Inside the walls, there was no army left to defend her. Just civilians, clergy, and the desperate. Saladin entered Jerusalem on October 2, 1187, exactly 88 years after the Crusaders had conquered it in 1099. The first Crusaders had taken Jerusalem in a massacre so complete that blood ran through the streets. Muslims, Jews, Christians, slaughtered indiscriminately. Saladin remembered. And chose differently. He allowed the Christian population to ransom themselves. He protected the churches. He freed thousands of the poor out of mercy. He walked through a conquered city and did it without revenge. He visited Baldwin's tomb. The tomb of the young king who had humiliated him. Who had cost him a decade of momentum. He stood there. And left it completely untouched. In an era defined by desecrating your enemy's memory, Saladin protected the grave of the one opponent he genuinely respected. If you made it this far, if that kind of story hits you the way it hits me, then do 3 things right now. Hit that like button so this video reaches people who need to see it. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter, because this only gets deeper. And share this with someone who thinks history is boring, and watch what happens. I'll see you in the next one.